James Reece witnessed the tragic deaths of his wife and daughter. Initially, he intended to deliver the criminals to justice, but sometimes the law is useless against certain individuals, so he had a surprise for the people who killed his wife and daughter. When the target appears, James Reece decisively pushes the remote control and the top tycoon is blown up with blood all over his face. James Reece took out his M416 and assembled it. He first took out 2 bodyguards with a burst of shots, then used the vehicle as cover to kill another one. Faced with enemy suppression, James Reece calmly threw a smoke bomb, then moved around and completed the kill. The tycoon fled into the building under the lead of professional bodyguards, still trying to suppress James Reece's actions with gunfire. However, James Reece, a former Navy SEAL, ended the bodyguards with 2 precise shots. The tycoon, unable to move, shot wildly but was hit in the shoulder by James Reece's bullet. James Reece quickly switched to his pistol and approached. The tycoon, full of fear and pleading for mercy, was met only with cold eyes and bullets. After avenging his family, James Reece quickly drove away, knowing that he had more targets to kill. James Reece, once the best commander of the U.S. Navy SEALs, received intelligence that a doctor was illegally manufacturing drugs in Syria. He immediately formulated a meticulous plan and began the operation. With 13 of the most elite Navy SEALs and assistants from the Coast Guard, they thought it would be a routine arrest operation. However, as soon as they infiltrated the location, they found a large number of landmines set up. As they prepared to evacuate, they encountered an ambush by enemy forces, and their only way out was blocked by strong firepower. In the end, one Coast Guard member collapsed mentally and triggered a landmine, causing heavy casualties to James Reece's team. A team member named Aaron Santiago de Leon led him to a successful evacuation. Such a major incident naturally led to an investigation. However, when the prosecutor released the recording, it contained words he had never said. While his memory indicated that the Coast Guard triggered the landmine, the recording showed that it was his own Navy SEALs. This made the usually confident James Reece start to doubt his sanity. However, the examining doctor believed it was a stress disorder and advised him to go home and rest. James Reece and Aaron Santiago de Leon raised their glasses in farewell, thinking they could return home to live peacefully with their wives and daughters. However, James unexpectedly received a call informing him of Aaron Santiago de Leon's suicide. NCIS agent Josh Holder, in charge of the investigation, told him that Aaron Santiago de Leon had used a 9mm pistol to blow off the back of his own head during a standoff. However, James, who was familiar with his teammate, immediately exclaimed that it was impossible. He had been drinking with him just yesterday, and Aaron Santiago de Leon preferred the 1911 .45 pistol, not the despised 9mm, to end his own life. With doubts in his mind, James Reece sought out his good friend Ben Edwards, and together they analyzed the many suspicious aspects of the operation. The first was their operational plan, which seemed to have been anticipated by the enemy. The second was the modification of the operational recording, which did not match their memories. The third was that Aaron Santiago de Leon had no reason to commit suicide, and the gun he used was incorrect. With many questions, James Reece approached the Navy Admiral for answers, only to be questioned about his mental state. However, on his way home, James Reece noticed a car following him. He instructed his wife to go home and protect their daughter while he dealt with it alone. However, when he quietly approached with his gun, he found only a female journalist. It turned out that Katie Duranek had discovered that there might be a conspiracy behind the accident. She also produced Aaron Santiago de Leon's autopsy report, which showed that he had died the day before James Reece returned. Although he remembered drinking with Aaron Santiago de Leon the day before and then suddenly Aaron Santiago de Leon disappeared, the chaotic memories made James Reece somewhat unable to distinguish between reality and illusion. After locking up his gun, he bid farewell to his wife and went to the hospital for examination. As James Reece was slowly being pushed into the MRI machine, the flashing lights made him constantly recall the gruesome scene of his teammate's death, his good brother who had faced life and death with him. If he had truly caused his death through his own mistake, he would probably never forgive himself in this lifetime. He didn't know how long it took for the scan to be completed, but James Reece found a masked man pointing a gun at him. He dared not make any unnecessary movements, as another gun aimed at his temple, clearly attempting to stage his suicide. James Reece countered with an elbow strike, then swiftly disarmed and incapacitated one assailant. However, a momentary dizziness allowed the other attacker to slash James Reece with a knife. After dodging several more attacks, he successfully pinned the enemy against the wall, but the other assailant regained consciousness and pressed James Reece's head towards the knife. In a critical moment, unable to break free from the grip, James Reece bit the enemy's arm and then covered their eyes to prevent them from grabbing the gun. Once he retrieved a weapon, he immediately fired several shots, rendering the enemy immobile. and pursued them with disciplined firearm habits, maintaining proper shooting posture as he advanced. Yet, as James Reece inspected the weapon, he realized it was the same one he had locked away in his safe. A sense of foreboding washed over him, prompting him to call his family, only to receive no answer. He immediately dialed emergency services and hurried home. Upon arrival, he witnessed a scene that shattered his heart. James Reece repeatedly apologized to his wife and daughter, desperately wishing it was all just a hallucination. As he looked at the family portrait drawn by his daughter, he vowed to avenge his loved ones by exposing the mastermind behind the scenes. However, NCIS agent Josh Holder, in charge of the investigation, only mentioned that everything was under scrutiny. He even speculated whether James Reece's post-traumatic stress disorder had resurfaced, suggesting he was mentally unstable and responsible for everything. Furious, James Reece sought out the Navy admiral, requesting another department to intervene in the investigation, but was immediately refused. The admiral once again questioned James Reece's mental state, which enraged him to the point of pinning the admiral against the wall. At that moment, Katie Buranek found James Reece again, presenting him with his diagnosis records. She also learned that NCIS agent Josh Holder was the first to arrive at the scene of the shootout, yet he claimed there were no bodies or bloodstains present. It all seemed like either James Reece's delusional combat or someone had cleaned up the traces of the fight in advance. Katie then produced the police report from Aaron Santiago de Leon's case, and James Reece immediately saw the connection. Both cases had NCIS agent Josh Holder as the first responder, which was unusual because the police were typically the first on the scene. This raised suspicions. James Reece immediately began investigating NCIS agent Josh Holder's background on the dark web. The more he looked, the more familiar the face became, until he realized it was identical to that of the assassin he had thought was targeting him. He never imagined it was someone from within, and he added NCIS agent Josh Holder to his hit list, embarking on a mission of revenge. First, James Reece thoroughly investigated NCIS agent Josh Holder's daily routine. While he was out, James Reece quietly infiltrated NCIS agent Josh Holder's home, took photos of the desktop details with his phone, used specialized equipment to copy computer data, and then carefully restored everything to its original state before leaving, as if he had never been there. Ben Edwards, who received the information, quickly discovered that 2 days before James Reece's family was killed, NCIS agent Josh Holder had accessed his fingerprint information from the Navy database, and his fingerprint was the password to open the weapon safe. This meant that even if NCIS agent Josh Holder did not physically commit the murders, he was still culpable for the deaths of James Reece's wife and daughter. Under the cover of a dark night, James Reece, now a vengeful figure, once again infiltrated NCIS agent Josh Holder's home. He first disarmed him by taking away his gun, then woke him up by putting the gun in his mouth. He used zip ties to bind his hands to prevent resistance. Eventually, NCIS agent Josh Holder revealed a name, Saul Agnon, stating that he had only taken money from him and followed his orders, without knowing any other details. However, at this moment, James Reece experienced a moment of dizziness. NCIS agent Josh Holder, seizing the opportunity, suddenly launched a counterattack, but James Reece ended it. He then disguised the scene to make it look like a suicide and left smoothly. Everyone involved in the operation would pay a bloody price. Through the name Saul Agnon, James Reece quickly obtained a keyword, Apex Industries, which would lead him to the mastermind behind it all. After organizing his equipment, including the S1897 shotgun, fully equipped M416 military axe, M24 sniper rifle, and numerous cash and bullets, packing everything into the trunk, James Reece drove to a restaurant to meet Katie Buranek. He hoped she could help investigate the mastermind behind Apex Industries. However, Katie Buranek produced a medical report showing that a tumor was affecting James Reece's thinking. She suspected that all of this was just a product of James Reece's imagination. Just then, James Reece noticed a suspicious man wearing sunglasses and immediately took Katie Buranek with him to escape. As soon as they got into the car, the man in sunglasses followed. Instead of escaping, James Reece accelerated and rammed into the car behind. He got out, checked under the car, and opened fire as soon as he encountered resistance, killing the enemy with several shots. After disarming him, he quickly changed the magazine and prepared for any further need. After obtaining the desired information, he quickly drove away from the scene of the gunfight. Seeing such a comprehensive target report finally made Katie Buranek believe that there was indeed a huge mastermind behind it all, and she finally agreed to help James Reece investigate Apex Industries. Meanwhile, Ben Edwards appeared at Saul Agnon's gathering, and the two prepared a lot of surprises for this wealthy tycoon. Such a character naturally requires the protection of a professional bodyguard. However, just as Saul Agnon was preparing to wash up and go to bed, music suddenly played in the empty mansion. He He got up to investigate, but a tall figure appeared behind him. Before he could react, a plastic bag was placed over his head, and his hands and feet were quickly tied up. Unable to breathe, Saul Agnon eventually passed out. When he woke up, he saw James Reece standing in front of him. He quickly gave up the name Steve Horn, and all of this was related to a project called RD-4895. Saul Agnon tried to deny responsibility and begged for forgiveness, claiming he was only doing it for the money. However, James Reece knew he was hiding something. He once again received information that the middleman Saul Agnon had hired to kill James Reece's wife and daughter was Senator Joe Pryor. Senator Joe Pryor was responsible for contacting the hitman and solving any problems for people. Given Saul Agnon's cooperative attitude, James Reece chose a death for him that was not painful. The truth of all this began to emerge. Investigating Steve Horn would reveal information about the RD-4895 project, and finding Senator Joe Pryor would lead to the killer of James Reece's wife and daughter. Without any hesitation, James Reece went straight to Senator Joe Pryor and ambushed him on the road, and he fell off a cliff. James Reece found an encrypted phone on Senator Joe Pryor, and then successfully unlocked it using CIA tools. He quickly discovered that there was a hitman training base nearby. Several former comrades in arms met to discuss their battle plan, and the showdown between top special forces and professional assassins was imminent. James Reece quietly sneaked into the assassin base with his comrades. Each person was responsible for slowly advancing while shooting arrows, remaining silent throughout the process. They lured out several enemies through radio interference, and the teammates ambushed on the hilltop shot and killed one person. Then, the infiltrators opened fire, and several enemies were killed on the spot. Maintaining their shooting positions, they killed another person, and the fleeing enemies were shot by Ben Edwards outside. Several people inside were also killed by James Reece, while the teammates on the hilltop provided fire support. Ben Edwards emptied his magazine and switched to his pistol to continue shooting. With the cover of his teammates, he reloaded, and several assassins held civilians hostage. One person aimed at a target, confirmed with eye contact, and then opened fire to kill the enemy. Facing the fleeing enemies who were calling for backup, they quickly pursued, maintaining their fire while keeping an eye on the target. At this point, James Reece and the assassin were only separated by a wall. He then saw bloody handprints on the wall, quietly moved to the window, shot the assassin in the shoulder, and then hung him on a hook. The assassin initially spoke arrogantly and used foul language, but the anger over the murder of his wife and daughter made James Reece somewhat irrational. He directly took out a military axe, tore open his bulletproof vest, and resolved him with one blow. When a person is forced to have nothing, he either dies or goes crazy. James Reece wanted to avenge his wife and daughter in the most painful way. As for repentance, he could talk to God about it. Each comrade in arms has their own family and friends. To avoid implicating them, James Reece decided to face the upcoming enemies alone, with only Liz Riley, a single and willing comrade, insisting on staying. Meanwhile, CIA SSA Stephen Ramsey also noticed James Reece's crazy actions. Through investigating the previous assassin, they learned that this person was one of Steve Horn's security forces, so they hoped to cooperate with Steve Horn. However, Steve Horn was very confident in his top security team. At this time, James Reece was monitoring outside the stone building. After carefully analyzing Steve Horn's travel habits, they discovered that he always carried 6 professional bodyguards when he went out. Now, with a group of FBI agents involved, it was almost impossible to capture Steve Horn alive and extract the truth from him. Coincidentally, Katie Buranek discovered through her investigation that Steve Horn had recently acquired Mike Tedesco's pharmaceutical company. They had previously mainly produced a drug to treat post-traumatic stress disorder in veterans, which Saul Agnon mentioned as the RD-4895 project. Mike Tedesco told Katie Buranek that the drug had indeed been successful in animal experiments. However, after Steve Horn used his connections to rush the drug to be used on Navy SEALs, it was found that the drug had side effects. Anyone who took the drug would develop a brain tumor within 3 months. To cover up the truth, Steve Horn, through his connections, orchestrated the death of James Reece's team, but the plan went awry, and 2 of them survived. So, they planned the tragic death of James Reece's wife and daughter again, deliberately creating the illusion of James Reece's post-traumatic stress disorder to expedite the US government's research on the RD-4895 project. Steve Horn manipulated everything and planned to kick Mike Tedesco out of management to completely control his company. To regain control of the company, Mike Tedesco promised Katie Buranek to expose Steve Horn's actions, secretly copied project-related materials, and arranged to meet with Katie Buranek. James Reece, who was observing Steve Horn, noticed that the 6 bodyguards who never separated had split into 2 groups today. Sensing something suspicious, he immediately followed one of the groups. Meanwhile, Mike Tedesco and Katie Buranek met in the subway. The data USB contained all the shareholder information for the RD4895 project. However, just after handing over the USB, Katie Buranek noticed a suspicious person approaching quietly. The two quickly ran towards an emergency exit. Unfortunately, Mike Tedesco was shot in the head, and the assassin continued to close in step by step. However, Katie Buranek, who was hiding around the corner, managed to kill the assassin, her first time taking a life, leaving her shaken. However, they couldn't stay there for long. As they emerged, a man walked towards them. As he approached, he reached for a gun in his waistband. At the critical moment, the two quickly retreated and found a safe alley. Katie Buranek revealed all the truths she had uncovered. Just 2 months ago, Steve Horn had put up $100 million to establish a bunch of shell companies. James Reece immediately realized that the shares of these companies might be the rewards for those enemies. Katie Buranek wanted to expose the matter to get the police involved. But James Reece didn't care about the law at this point. Those who had harmed his wife and daughter were not worthy of eating prison food. He took Katie Buranek's USB and warned her that Steve Horn would find and kill her, advising her to leave the city quickly. James Reece immediately sent the information to Ben Edwards for investigation. The next day, Ben Edwards called back. The names of the people who had been punished by James Reece before were all in the company, and the names that appeared later might involve a bigger mastermind behind the scenes. Ben Edwards advised him to calm down. James Reece might not be able to handle what was coming next. However, for James Reece, who had nothing to lose, he would not give up revenge even if the sky fell. After hanging up the phone, James Reece took a deep breath. The people involved turned out to be in the senior ranks of the Navy. These officials, with their wolf-like hearts, chose to sacrifice the elite Navy SEALs for money, in order to cover up the truth and even murder his wife and daughter. The enraged James Reece decided to start with Steve Horn. He instructed Liz Riley to help obtain a bunch of chemical agents for top Navy SEALs. Preparing explosives was simply too easy. He manually modified a directional explosive device. It was soon time to act. Steve Horn walked out of the building under Katie Buranek's escort. To avoid harming innocent civilians and teammates, Liz Riley parked the car at the intersection, deliberately creating a vacuum zone. When NCIS agent Josh Holder and the FBI found Liz Riley's car, James Reece was already preparing to detonate the bomb. However, Katie Buranek appeared in front of Steve Horn, thinking she had some evidence and naively hoping that Steve Horn would confess and surrender. However, Steve Horn, who manipulated everything for profit, didn't care at all. Just now, he had already cashed out and left. Those dead Navy SEALs had generated billions of dollars in revenue for him. At that moment, Katie Buranek saw James Reece across the street. He slowly backed away, alerting Steve Horn that something was wrong. However, it was too late, as James Reece pressed the button on the remote control. The civilians scattered and fled. Although Steve Horn survived by luck, his face was covered in blood. James Reece immediately shot and killed one bodyguard. Then, using a car as cover, he killed another person. Facing the enemy's suppression fire, he calmly threw a smoke bomb, then flanked and successfully killed another. The head of the bodyguard team wanted to retreat with Steve Horn, but James Reece sent him to his death with 2 bullets. Steve Horn, in panic, could only shoot randomly. James Reece accurately shot the gun out of his hand. Like the Grim Reaper, Steve Horn, full of fear, begged for forgiveness, but all that awaited him were cold eyes and bullets. James Reece saw Katie Buranek lying on the ground. In order not to involve her, he could only pretend not to know her and hurriedly leave. Similarly, in order not to involve his teammate Liz Riley, he chose to drive and attract all the attention of the police cars. However, at a corner, the police lying in ambush threw a spike strip, blowing out James Reece's tires. Forced to stop, James Reece quickly packed up his gear. FBI's NCIS agent Josh Holder shot at the car wildly. Approaching, they found that James Reece had already left, leaving only a pool of blood on the ground and some dropped drugs. James Reece ran wild in the wilderness. The blood dripping from his right hand showed that his situation was somewhat bad. After the owner left, James Reece broke into a hunter's cabin. First, he tuned the radio to the police frequency, then found some disinfectant to clean the wound and used electrode pads to stop the bleeding. When he was packing his backpack, he realized that he had forgotten the medicine. By now, his hand was starting to lose control, which could seriously affect his next move. James Reece, with no other options, could only search for usable supplies, a few signal flares and 2 boxes of radio batteries. He then confirmed his escape route on the map. Meanwhile, the FBI, with a large number of police dogs, began searching the mountains. The good news was that it started raining heavily, which undoubtedly bought James Reece some time to escape. Crouching at the foot of the mountain to avoid the rain, James Reece took out a drawing of his daughter. A happy time for the family of 3, all ruined by those people. Now, Steve Horn's name on the list was crossed out in his blood, and 3 more names were added below. All senior Navy officials James Reece had served with. They had trained to protect their comrades and families, but they were the first to break their vows. Early the next morning, the FBI mobilized the Trident Special Forces to arrest him. They quickly located James Reece using cell phone signals. The Trident team was well trained and had clear roles. However, who could have expected that James Reece was hiding right under their feet at this moment? One of the soldiers found a cell phone. Just as they were checking it, James Reece pulled the fuse in his hand. A flashbang and smoke grenade caused the soldiers to stiffen. James Reece suddenly stood up, grabbed one of them, and quickly escaped downhill. While running, he connected the 2 batteries and created a diversion. Command saw several sudden heat signatures on the screen and had to send the Trident team to investigate one by one. This allowed James Reece to successfully occupy the high ground. However, despite aiming at the soldiers several times as they caught up, he couldn't bring himself to shoot. By the time the soldiers reached the mountaintop, James Reece had disappeared without a trace, leaving only a bullet on the rocks. It shows James Reece's kindness to them and warning. At this moment, James Reece was climbing without any equipment. However, the tumor in his skull caused his arm to tremble continuously, and he fell. Fortunately, the backpack cushioned the fall, and he was not seriously injured. James Reece camped on the spot, ignited a signal flare to heat the blade red, and used the intense heat to cauterize the wound, causing his skin to curl up and stop bleeding. The intense pain even made this tough guy faint. In his unconsciousness, he dreamed of his sweet home, chatting sweet nothings with his wife. However, as they talked, the object in his hand turned into a military radio. SSA Stephen Ramsey wanted to persuade James Reece to lay down his weapons and not to kill innocents indiscriminately. However, James Reece knew very well who was innocent or not. He told SSA Stephen Ramsey that he would stop after killing everyone on the list. The next day, the Trident team resumed their search, this time deploying drones. James Reece noticed and shot down the drones, but his location was already exposed. He reached a soft spot in the mountain soil and buried all the bombs from his backpack. Just as he was about to detonate them, he was surrounded by the soldiers who had caught up with him. James Reece's hand holding the fuse trembled uncontrollably. If they continued to approach, it would trigger a landslide and they would all perish together. Seeing that they had no intention of backing down, James Reece detonated the bombs without hesitation. The soft soil turned into a torrent that pushed him down the hill. Fortunately, he wasn't seriously injured. However, when he saw the buried soldier, he couldn't bear it and stopped his escape. Not only did he dig him out with all his strength, but he also performed CPR to revive him. The soldiers who caught up and saw their comrade realized that James Reece was not a bad person. They abandoned the pursuit and announced that James Reece had died in a landslide. Liz Riley, who heard the news report, was somewhat devastated. The man who had once saved her on the battlefield might never come back. However, just when she was in despair, James Reece returned. The two hugged each other tightly. The camaraderie that those Navy high-ranking officials had disregarded was truly precious to them. However, James Reece could not stop yet. The tumor in his brain could take his life at any moment. He had to continue his revenge while he still could. With a leap, his target was the Navy base. His good friend Ben Edwards was already there to meet him. The two observed the movements of the 3 high-ranking officials from a distance. The Navy base was guarded by 5,000 soldiers, and a direct assault would be suicide. However, Admiral Gerald Piller never left the base. Through Ben Edwards' intelligence, they knew that the 3 high-ranking officials were not unified. Commander Bill Cox and Chief of Staff Aaron Santiago de Leon were already considering retreat, making them the best breakthrough point. That night, Captain Howard was preparing to escape with his family when Ben Edwards had been waiting at the door for a long time. On the other side, James Reece found Commander Bill Cox at the bar entrance, and the two immediately fought without wasting any words. Although Commander Bill Cox was strong and initially had the upper hand, he underestimated James Reece's determination for revenge. Commander Bill Cox's arm was directly twisted and then a sedative needle was injected into his thigh. When he woke up again, he was already tied to a wooden stake by James Reece. He had trained Navy SEALs like this, teaching James Reece to trust his comrades and protect his family. However, he was the first to break his oath, betraying the elite team for money, leading them to die in the dirty sewer. Now, James Reece was going to punish Commander Bill Cox in the same way. As Commander Bill Cox's strength faded, he was finally drowned alive at the edge of the shore. On the other side, Ben Edwards had also brought Captain Howard's family over. Facing James Reece, who seemed like the Grim Reaper, Captain Howard tried to deflect blame while pleading for his family's safety. However, James Reece pointed out that all the Navy SEALs he had killed also had families, and now Captain Howard regretted his actions. James Reece promised to spare Captain Howard's family if he helped him with one thing. That night, Captain Howard visited Admiral Gerald Piller. He was nervous, constantly checking his watch, and seemed unnatural. Admiral Gerald Piller asked him what was wrong, and Captain Howard handed him a phone from his pocket, from which James Reece's voice could be heard. At first, Admiral Gerald Piller didn't care, insulting James Reece and mocking him for thinking he could do anything alone against the 5,000 soldiers at the naval base. However, James Reece didn't respond. Instead, he calmly asked if a high-explosive bomb containing 2,000 steel balls could tear him apart. At this moment, Captain Howard tremblingly opened his shirt. And both of the callous high-ranking Navy officials met their demise. James Reece thought his revenge was complete, but then Katie Buranek sent him another name. It turned out that Katie Buranek was planning to expose everything she knew on the internet. However, her media contact never received any information. Realizing something was wrong, Katie Buranek quickly packed her things to leave, but it was already too late. The Secretary of Defense, Lorraine Hartley, appeared before her. At that moment, Katie Buranek finally understood the extent of the chain of interests involved. How could a top billionaire completely buy off an admiral? And how could the Secretary of Defense, in order to continue the $700 billion RD 4895 project, allow Katie Buranek to ruin her plans? Knowing she couldn't escape, Katie Buranek sent James Reece the name of the Secretary of Defense. Seeing the name, James Reece's eyes turned cold. Although this ultimate target was unexpected, he was not afraid. The Secretary of Defense took Katie Buranek to her safe house on a remote island, guarded by a dozen professional special forces. She chose this location to deal with James Reece without any official records. However, he ultimately underestimated one person's determination for revenge. James Reece and Ben Edwards had devised a meticulous plan. James Reece would quietly dive to approach the safe house, while Ben Edwards would set up a sniper rifle on the lighthouse for support. When James Reece reached the designated location, Ben Edwards would detonate the yacht with a single shot. Taking advantage of the distraction caused by the explosion, James Reece would quickly advance, eliminating any obstacles. Ben Edwards would provide sniper cover, and also destroy the lighting to create natural cover for James Reece. However, the Secretary of Defense's bodyguards were not idle. They suppressed James Reece from 2 fire points, almost hitting him. Ben Edwards took another shot, providing cover fire for James Reece to move while he reloaded his sniper rifle. James Reece fired back with his handgun while moving, and when he ran out of bullets, he quickly switched to another magazine and continued advancing. However, Ben Edwards noticed that an FBI boat was approaching, and the agents, including SSA Stephen Ramsey, had joined the security detail. James Reece needed to speed up his actions. He used a grenade to kill the enemies behind the car, then approached and shot one man, maintaining his firing position and taking down another. As he entered the building, he quickly shifted his aim, then changed his stance again. After moving upstairs, he switched between left and right hands, entering a hallway that was easy to defend but hard to attack. He used a smoke grenade followed by a thermal imaging scope, and then threw a flashbang grenade. However, at the next corner, the last bodyguard was clearly terrified, raising his hands and opening a security door. Despite James Reece's caution, he decided to end the man's life. Katie Buranek stood in front of James Reece, saying she would expose the Secretary of Defense. However, the Secretary of Defense knew that either she would die at James Reece's hands today, or she would spend the rest of her life in prison. Without waiting for James Reece to make a decision, she resolutely picked up a pistol and ended her own life. At this moment, all the names on James Reece's ultimate list were cleared. Even when caught up by SSA Stephen Ramsey, he calmly removed his equipment. At this moment, life or death made no difference to him.
I'm already dead.
Afterwards, Katie Buranek exposed all the information she had investigated, revealing the ugliness of RD 4895. However, she found out that there was still one shell company that had not been uncovered. After hesitating for a moment, Katie Buranek finally sent the last name to James Reece. The scene shifted to Ben Edwards vacationing at sea. As he descended into the cabin, James Reece suddenly appeared from behind him, and the last name was none other than his good friend Ben Edwards. It turned out that Ben Edwards, who was responsible for the intelligence, had known all along about the switch involving James Reece's team. Instead of letting them suffer and die in a hospital bed, he preferred these tough men to die on the battlefield. This was how James Reece's team was misled by false intelligence and all perished in the tragic events in Syria. Ben Edwards hadn't spent any of the money he received and had not been involved in anything since. But when he learned that James Reece's wife and daughter had died tragically because of him, Ben Edwards couldn't sit still anymore. He followed James Reece into life and death, just to redeem his own sins. James Reece raised his gun at Ben Edwards, the traitor who had betrayed him. All the enemies received their just punishment, and the family photo with all the names written on it was blown away by the wind. So, do you think James Reece will pull the trigger and kill Ben Edwards? I am a movie enthusiast. Stay tuned for the next installment in the series. See you next time.